Maybe.
I see live on our screen. I think we're streaming.
It says live, but it is not showing up on.
I think
Oh, there we
Facebook
go. Okay,
always
we got
live
it.
when it's
All
here.
right, perfect. Success. All right, welcome to What's Going On with Our Career Garage. This week we are talking to Dawn Thilmany, who works for Colorado State University, but does a pile of really cool things out in the community. And I am really excited to have her on the show this week, partly because she has been delightful in helping me test out StreamYard this morning. As many of you know, we've been having trouble the last couple of weeks getting the stream to go live at the correct time. So today we are testing out StreamYard, which I am very hopeful will work. And then we can actually have solved some of the tech issues that are involved with starting a YouTube channel. Welcome to entrepreneurship. You have to learn a lot of things that are not within your sphere of expertise. And that is how that goes sometimes. Anyway, Dawn, tell us about you. You are also pretty connected to rural entrepreneurship, both through the work you do at CSU and the work that you do out in the broader world. So give yourself an introduction.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here today, Jesse. I am faculty actually at Colorado State University in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. Been here since 1997, so actually almost all my career has been at Colorado State and working with Colorado communities. But luckily, some work I do with national partners lets me see cool stuff going on across the country. So although I started and I still reside in a Department of Ag and Resource Economics. I came to this work kind of through the food systems dimension. I'm mostly in the beginning working with ag and food systems entrepreneurs because of that faculty role. For those who don't know it, at Colorado State, we're land grants, so we have a teaching mission, and so I'm still in the classroom, a research mission, and an extension mission. And I've had an extension role since almost 2000. So that just means that some of the stuff we do in the classroom and teach in the classroom, we take out to rural communities, and been doing that for a long time, but more formally with the Regional Economic Development Institute that we started in 2016. It's really taken on more of a flavor of rural economic development way more broadly. So rural areas, you're always still going to have ag and food come up, but now we're going to work with entrepreneurs and policymakers that think about entrepreneurs across all dimensions. So it's been a really fun evolution.
Yeah. And so I want to clarify a thing that you said in there just for anybody who doesn't know. So there's Colorado State University, and then there's the Colorado State University Extension. And this is a pretty common thing you see in a lot of states. They'll have the state university and then they'll have the state university extension. And the extension does some really interesting work. But if you don't live in an ag community, you have no idea what an extension office is. So can you just give us a brief overview of like what that even means?
Yeah, so people probably heard of something called the Homestead Act. It was one of Lincoln's great innovations, but they gave every state a little bit of land to develop a university and develop a land grant university specifically, where usually it's focused on one campus. Here in Colorado, it's Fort Collins, but then heavily encouraged to set up an extension system that has a county-based focus to it. So here in Colorado, almost every county has at least one extension office, and the county pays half of that bill, and the university pays half of the bill to make sure we have an educator in pretty much every pocket of the communities. And you're right, agriculture knows it best because we run the county fairs, we provide ag field days. 4-H actually is usually somewhat of a connector to cities through their youth programs, and then increasingly, we do have more of a reach than agriculture. So if you've ever seen a master gardener program where people also want to help you figure out how to keep your yard beautiful or green, that's extension. So it's basically anytime you feel like there's an educational topic, that having someone in the community and knowing the very place-based aspects of that community will help them do a better job. That's where extension shines. And so it comes up in entrepreneurship too, because not all models work well in all places, but those people live in your community, so they always know how to kind of truth whether something or an idea being brought from campus makes sense or not.
Yeah. And
so get to know your county extension office if you don't yet. Commonly it's in the county courthouse. but they're all over the place. But we go get to know them if you don't know them yet. They do cool
They
things.
are. Everybody I've ever met from the extension offices here in Colorado have been delightful, delightful humans. And there is all kinds of information out there. Even if you're a food entrepreneur, Colorado has a thing called the Cottage Foods Act, where you can actually sell home produced goods under a specific legislation policy act thing. And in order to be able to do that, the extension runs the course that says these are the basic safety requirements you have to in order to sell food at a farmer's market, and talks you through the legal pieces. So it is a very, very nice early step that you can do for a food entrepreneur to really test out that product and have that be a viable path to entrepreneurship with a very, very low lift, which is one of my personal favorite things about entrepreneurship. Is there's a lot of businesses you could start with some gumption and a little bit of time and not a ton of resources that can really take you some really cool places.
That's a perfect example. We should be having you do our promos, but yeah, I think last time I talked to that team, that legislation has been in place a little over 10 years. I think we've trained over 7,000 people to be able to operate out of their homes. So that's a great example of what we do in the entrepreneurship space and the food space. So perfect example.
I'm here for you. I got you. But yeah, so one of the things that you do that I really appreciate is really looking at that role of the economics of entrepreneurship, particularly in rural communities. And rural communities are kind of funny in how you end up studying them because by definition, there are not as many people there. And so one of the things that's true when you want good data is you want a large enough sample size to be able to draw conclusions. And you also can't always do that in rural areas because you and I were at an event in northwestern Weld County a while back, and that town had 25 people in it. And it's hard to draw a conclusion about anything when you only have 25 people in town. So when you look at those data points and as you study the role of entrepreneurship in rural communities, how do you contend with that actual lack of statistically significant data and figure out how to even study places with such small populations in some areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's kind of twofold. One is that if you know the market size they're really gonna probably be servicing is much larger, then it's almost a study of the geography of economics. So and that's why food is really popular to think about in rural spaces, because if you make a food product in a rural space, in particular, like in a state like Colorado that is a Colorado Proud program, you really have access to the whole Colorado population as a place you can sell that might still consider you a homegrown hero. So, some of it is us talking realistically about what is the market size an entrepreneur wants to try to tackle, and with things that are like that might have ubiquitous interest to people, it's great. Or in some of our pockets of rural Colorado, it's about tourists flowing through, and it's really measuring the flow of traffic through there, even if they don't have a lot of population. And then lastly, this is where it really helps. I get a telescope from county level all the way up to the national level, is then we work as a field across ag economics to share patterns of like, okay, but if we keep seeing in counties that are sparsely populated, these models work, we can steal and cherry pick best practices from upstate New York and bring them to the ground here in Colorado. It's like, well, there was a community that looked like this, had a lot of the same characteristics as this, and this model worked there. So we really kind of almost always try to come at the problem from a few different directions and say, what is relevant information here? But you're right, sometimes it's very, very far away from what would be a traditional market research model.
Yeah, and honestly, that market research piece is one of my favorite parts about working in rural entrepreneurship. I'm actually writing some market research curricula right now for a business incubator program I'm working with that I'm hoping to turn into a course for our platform later. But just thinking about that concept of how do you do market research testing and how do you think about it from this rural perspective where maybe your demographic isn't where you live, maybe it is, maybe you have to get in touch with some of these broader state pieces. Maybe you have to connect with other state programs, right? I love the Colorado Proud program. If you don't live in Colorado, then what the Colorado Proud program does is it works with a bunch of food businesses and says, beer is grown in Colorado, and then there's an actual sign in the grocery store and on the labels that says, this is part of the Colorado Proud program. This is grown in Colorado. And sometimes it's really helpful. There was a food recall on carrots a while back from one of the big California manufacturers that is often the organic carrots that I buy in the grocery store, but it happened to be in the fall. So the carrots I bought when the recall was happening were actually from Greeley. So I was like, great, thanks, Colorado Proud. I don't have to be concerned about my carrots because they came locally.
We didn't have that problem in Colorado. Yeah, that's a great
Right?
example.
We didn't have that problem here. And so it can be a very cool program. And I love those broader state programs. One of the other things that you do is help people figure out some of those how to study. And so the last time I saw Dawn, we were at a conference together called Pro Green, which is a landscaping conference in Denver. And for anybody who's digging in the backlog of the show, my very first What's Going On was with John, the CEO of the Associated Landscaping Contractors of Colorado.
Really? Great.
People who puts on Pro Green. So you can go digging back in our archives for that. But Dawn gave a really cool presentation about how to study the green industry, which notoriously does not lend itself to a single individual business categorization. And so it really reminded me a lot of how you look at kind of the economics of certain demographics in certain industries, where if there's not a clear demographic study point, or it doesn't neatly track in some way, it can be really hard to draw conclusions around that data. So tell us a little bit about the project you're working on, about the green industry and how to study that.
Well, first, the green industry is great too, because there's a ton of entrepreneurs in that as well. Super entrepreneurial people. So the green industry, again, broadly is you go to a garden center, or you have someone landscape your yard, or you have someone maintain the landscape of your yard, or you have someone come fix or put in your irrigation system for your yard. Those are all the green industry. So it's basically anything that's the beautification of our environment with plants. So you're starting to hear the problem already, that there's lots of little pieces to that puzzle that are not always glued together. But it really is a great way to even do economics 101 of, this country is so far through its development process that they've made almost things invisible to people, of like how all the stuff behind the scenes works, so that things look as pretty as they do and people get fed and there's always things on shelves. We're at that stage of development. But then when you want to start studying economics, you have to start making people pay attention to, well, if you're going to have good yards, you need all these other pieces and industries working too, or that's not all going to happen. And that's important for anyone, because they want things to be easy to find and do and make happen. But for someone who's actually trying to tell the story of how important an industry is to a community, or how important an entrepreneur is to a community, you can start talking about, well, yeah, and you're supporting my business, but you're also supporting 16 other businesses that I buy supplies from, or throw business to, or give referrals to. And so that's really how I got to develop a relationship with the green industry, is telling their economic story of like where all they're impactful. And it's going to be super important again this year, because there's going to be talk about shutting water down so people can't water their yards and stuff. But even again, that's a great sign of entrepreneurship. That industry is a little panicked, but they're also very entrepreneurial and saying, well, if we can't water the way we used to water, let's rebuild your landscape and make you more xeriscaped, or help you figure out an irrigation solution so we can maintain half of your yard really well, and then make part of it dry. So even there's an entrepreneur, even when there's a big shock to the system, you see entrepreneurs step up. So the green industry is the one I'm working with right now to tell their story of how important they are. Looks like they're going to be about a $7 billion industry for the state. But what's more important in bringing it back to entrepreneurs is that any one then business operating in that system can talk about, yeah, again, you're supporting my business, but realize when you're supporting my business, you're indirectly supporting 16 other players in the supply chain that we're keeping Colorado based and with Colorado jobs, and people who live here spend their money here and send their kids to school here. So it's always fun to do kind of those studies not just be an economist, but then talk about what it means for your community.
Yeah. It is really true that adage, there's the old statistic that gets floated around a lot, that when you spend dollars locally, it circulates locally for 3 or 4 or more times before it leaves that community. And entrepreneurship really functions as that in practice. You spend a dollar with one company who spends it at another company who spends it at another company, and that piece really can keep the money flowing through the small business ecosystem.
One thing I'll riff on while we're on that is, we certainly don't want to say it's a bad idea to go to instead Home Depot or Walmart to get the plants you're going to put in your yard, because there's still some jobs created there. They're not jobs. It's just when you go to the local nursery center, the chance that plant was grown from seed in Colorado, if you buy it at Home Depot, is very low. The chance that plant was grown from seed in Colorado, if you buy it at your nursery center, way higher. And that's not only important economically, because more of that money circulates here, but also, this is a lesson for entrepreneurs again. Always think about where your place matters, and your place can be part of your marketing promotion. So what we say with the green industry is also, we have a weird climate. We have these weird shifts and major shifts in temperatures day to day. We just went through one this last weekend. Those plants were grown in and hardened in and started their life in those climatic conditions. So then putting them in their yard, there's going to be no shock to them at all. Again, nothing wrong with plants grown in Georgia, but if plants grown in Georgia are shipped up to your Home Depot and you put them in your yard, the place-based resiliency of that plant is not going to be great. So that's just a really specific example of how an entrepreneur really needs to think about how to use their place as an advantage. And the green industry is a perfect example, just because it is so localized, and even the benefits that you get from beautiful yards and stuff. So that's one example of I have the economic story of why it's better not to bring in those plants from Georgia. But then a good entrepreneur in one of those garden centers, if they train their employees right, can have that whole storyboard ready for telling someone why it's also going to be better for that plant, because it's just used to our crazy climates and temperatures here.
Yes. Yes, we are. I originally grew up in Pennsylvania, and the temperature swings and movement in Colorado is not the same in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so, I had another question. So you have done a lot of work with a lot of different industries, right? And I have run into you at events with Downtown Colorado. I've run into you at events with the Rocky Mountain Microfinance Institute. I've run into you at events for the Small Business Administration and the Small Business Development Centers. And you're kind of all over the place, which I absolutely adore. I'm always delighted when I get to run into Dawn at an event.
That is the nicest way I've ever been called schizophrenic in my life. Thank you.
No, you do a lot of things, and it's all great. But so as you move through these different entrepreneurial spaces and you interact with all these different demographics and communities, what are the things that you see working to support entrepreneurship, both rurally and in urban and suburban areas? Because you're a lot of places. And so when you look at what's really, really working to support small businesses, particularly in those early stages, as you know, Outgrow Your Garage really focuses on those first 5-ish years when you're most likely to fail. What do you see working to get more of these small businesses through those early growth stages and into successful, stable revenue for themselves and their communities?
Yeah, I wish I always knew the golden boulder, but I'll really come back to some of it is just the right personality. And if there's one thing I've learned is that there are people who are just born with an entrepreneurial spirit and resiliency. Sometimes I wish I had more of it. I think I always joke about the thing of I teach it because I can't do it. I can recognize an entrepreneur almost within 5 minutes of a conversation with them. I was just always way too risk averse to be a good entrepreneur. So some of it is just having the right people. And there is something about Colorado, and we have data on this. We attract the type of people that have in-migrated and or stay in Colorado just tend to be more entrepreneurial. They have that right mix of personality to make this not be a barrier to them trying to start their dreams. So Colorado just seems to attract them. But in terms of what the community can do, we have pretty good evidence that, some of the traditional things matter, like having a good tax policy and having an SPDC office. But really, if you get into what's place-based again, building some kind of network of community practice where people aren't alone and can share ideas. That's why I'm a big fan of Startup Colorado. We at CSC were trying to do a bit more ourselves, love downtown Colorado. But again, Colorado is blessed with a whole bunch of different ways you could plug into communities of practice and not be alone in this, because no matter how independent you are, there are times you just are going to benefit from advice or best practices that someone else has gone through it with, or even this program here. So some of it is having networks. And again, it's harder in rural areas because you don't just have the critical mass, but it's become easier and easier with, live streams you can watch, but I'd still encourage people, go to the conferences. That's where you really make the relationships that you can dive into. Second, I would say is, I always say, the people I've seen do best do a really, really intentional job of reading some materials and watching some media and interacting with some people who are wildly different than them. And, this is when I started working in agriculture, was always my mantra, is like, quit reading the stuff you always read. Go read a Martha Stewart Living at that time, that's dated now. Watch the Food Network a little bit, understand what people really want from a food and eating experience, or if you're doing agritourism, the Travel Channel, and just realize how, okay, you don't value something, that's fine. Go figure out what other people value. And I think what happened by accident, even somewhat in rural Colorado, is just the tourism that happens just kind of forced that. It's like, even if you did go out and try to find that stuff and read that stuff and interact with those people, they were showing up on your main street, in your coffee shop, in your diner, at your farm. And so it kind of force fed that. But I'd say, first thing I always tell entrepreneurs, just run in a wildly diverse circle, or at least consume media and find a way to interact with people in wildly different circles, because that's your market research. That's you understanding how you cannot understand how someone would spend that amount of money for that thing. It doesn't matter that you understand it. It's that you saw it happen and you saw it as a market opportunity. But I think Colorado, again, benefits because so many tourists just rifle through here, that it's going to happen even if you're not intentional. The more intentional you are, generally, the better. And then I would say, the third thing is that I think some of our communities have been really authentically good about trying to figure out how to reinvigorate their main streets or something about their community that's unique. We do have those like 1 day or 1 weekend festivals. We've really been good about bringing the creative economy into our rural areas as well as we can. And that's why if you look at any map where they're measuring prosperity, vitality, a lot of Colorado always is towards the positive end of the heat map, is because we just have some people and leaders who really intentionally try to make some of that happen. But, we still know there's some struggles there too, but those are the patterns I've seen that made Colorado consistently be on the top of the list when we talk about entrepreneurial states.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we talk about in my house a lot is how I am absolutely an entrepreneur. I have frequently said in the past, and will continue to say in the future, that I am actually unemployable. I am really bad at having a job. I'm great at working for myself. And atrocious at working for other people. And we have a conversation a lot about how Colorado is really the state where people come and move into, right? If you look at the demographics of Colorado, our birth rate is not at a replacement level. So Colorado as a state, our population relies on people moving into it from other places. And I think when you have a place where people are constantly moving to it, you're already kind of filling for people who have a higher risk tolerance, because they're willing to move away from what has been familiar and move to another place. And I think we see the same thing with immigrant populations, where you have a lot of entrepreneurship that happens with people who immigrate from other countries, because you're already self-selecting for people who are willing to leave behind familiar things and take a risk on a new venture. And I think that's one of the things that makes this country in general really successful. We do reward that come here, start a business. It's great. And so,
well, that's a good point. And I think where I do still see some rural parts of Colorado struggling is they have not seen that dynamic always as positive. They've seen it as disruptive, and it is disruptive. But just whenever, again, a community can be intentional about how do we take a disruption that feels super uncomfortable and map it into something that could be kind of interesting. That's the communities that are more vibrant right now, is because they've done that pivot, and it is really hard. And we are also a state very steeped in legacy and traditions. Particularly, I work with agriculture a lot in rural communities. They're like, but that's not how it used to be. And just getting people to realize, but part of the switch from how it used to be to the new thing is, again, an opportunity to be vibrant. But again, that's where it's great to have a mix of leaders in your community, because you also want some people who are more stable and are the ones always with doing the what if scenarios and a little bit risk averse to balance the entrepreneurs. But again, where we've seen communities not thrive as much as where those entrepreneurs or new incomers or people who are that churn are seen overly seen as a threat instead of an opportunity.
Yeah. One of the things I think a lot about rural entrepreneurship is when you are thinking as a rural community about how do you increase entrepreneurship, how do you increase workforce development, how do you increase economic opportunity in general in your area, any entrepreneurship program really needs to be paired with youth programming and youth entrepreneurship program. Because when we're talking about maintaining the legacy and the history of communities and the history that's there, a big part of that is because youth leave. People who have grown up in that town don't have access to a job, or they don't want to take over the family farm because, frankly, farming is hard work and it's kind of thankless and it doesn't pay a lot. And so really thinking about how do you create opportunities for people who grow up in an area and want to stay and can stay, and making sure that that is a viable option for them and their family and however else you want to set that up. And then also that helps with people who want to move in and come. And I think there is a balance on that, particularly when you're looking at communities hire economic development managers. Okay, if you're bringing in to support economic development in your community, should that be a person who is steeped in the local community? Should it be a local person who really understands the relationships and the people in that area? Or do you want to bring in somebody from outside who might have a new perspective and some new ideas? And every community is going to be a little bit different and come down differently on that decision. And sometimes it'll work and sometimes it doesn't. But that learning process, I think, is really important. But I think a lot about the thing that allowed me to move to my rural community from Metro Denver was that I was an entrepreneur. I could come with my own job. My partner works remotely. So we brought our jobs with us, and that meant that we could come to this town, we could spend dollars here, we could live in a place that we really love, we could get connected to the local community, but we weren't stressed about making sure we could pay our mortgage and could we find a job. And I think entrepreneurship can really create some of those places. And even if you have a house where one person has that risk tolerance, and one person certainly does not. Because it does matter that risk tolerance is huge for entrepreneurs.
But yeah, I guess that speaks to, like, it is a family affair too, right? Because you're really involving your whole family once you decide you're going to be entrepreneurial and run something out of your home, or you're going to spend a lot of your hours at something that takes you from home. So yeah, that's even another reason to bring in youth. But I do believe there's an increasing interest in, like, realizing we set up an educational system, and I'm a product of it, that set me up to work for other people. There was never, I think, a single part of my education that had me think actively about what if I want to do something. The one exception is I was an FFA, and when I started, I came from a very traditional Iowa farm with very traditional field crops. But when I did do the competitions about, when we're back to the green industry, nursery and landscaping and flowers, I was like, this is pretty cool. I like this. And it looked like the margins were way. This is how I also knew I was going to become an economist, because this is a high school going, like, their price points are way better than our price points. And I remember even coming back to my dad once and saying, like, we could set up a nursery on part of our land, and like we could do some of this. And I just got a definitive kind of no, that's not the kind of farm we are. That was me probably a burgeoning entrepreneur saying like, this is a way I could come back and I could contribute because you're not going to let me drive the big John Deere, but I'm really good with plans and I'm really good with customer interface. So I went and worked for another nursery for a couple of years on my summers, and it's hard work too. It's just a different version of hard work than traditional ag. But I guess I was setting myself up to be somewhat working with the green industry way back then because I just saw I started to see the pivot of like, in a weird way. So at that time, particularly U.S. citizens were seeing plants as a more special thing than food, even though we need food to exist because we'd made food so ubiquitously just kind of expected it will always be there. The people, you just go to the grocery store, whereas the nursery centers became the place to go and play on a weekend and get plants and stuff. There just was more joy at them in a weird way than the ag I was affiliated with. And so, that's even an example there of like, if there had been an outlet and if I'd had any entrepreneurial education, would I not kept going on and getting a PhD? Maybe not. So I think finding ways to have youth see themselves as entrepreneurs, if that's the way they're wired, super important. And that's why I would love for people to come to CSU, but sometimes the community colleges do better. They have the small business development centers. They let people stay in place. So I think we have a good portfolio of educational system and programs that, and then we have entrepreneurs like you doing things for lifelong learning. That's what we really need in this country, is for people to think like, still a big proponent of 4-year degrees. I think a ton of people benefit from having them. I think it's one pathway for people, and we need to keep exploring all the pathways because we're just wired very differently as people. I love being in a classroom and learning. Other people, it drives them nuts and they want to be doing something immediately. There are entrepreneurs, and there's a different educational pathway for that.
Yeah. I deeply wish that I had known entrepreneurship was an option when I was a kid. There are several pathways that I could have taken that probably would have worked out better for me for the first 15, 20 years of my professional career before I realized I could start my own business and be my own boss, particularly in that seasonal world where margins are tight. It can be really hard to find a job that pays well. But yeah, so we have been chatting for about half an hour, which is about where I like to cut things off. This has been delightful. Is there anything you want people to know, or resources you want to share, or anything you want to close out with?
I would just say if you're interested in what we do at CSU, I'm only part of the puzzle, but do check out the Regional Economic Development Institute. It's easily findable by Google. But also, in a little over a week, I think Jesse and I are both heading to, every year downtown Colorado has an In the Game conference. Super engaging, super not a typical conference. You're not just sitting and listening to people, you're out doing stuff. But if you're interested in the space, that's one of the organizations I would say it's fun to plug into. Go to a conference. They have everything from tiny little burbs to the biggest cities. They're sharing their ideas and their best practices. So find a community practice to plug into, so you're not doing this alone. And it's again partly how I got to know Jesse. So that's my thing most coming up the most quickly is downtown Colorado. But also we have lots of other organizations all around the state. So find a place to plug in if you haven't already.
Yeah, absolutely. I am really excited about that conference. There's a session, I was reading the schedule last night, and there's a session on revolving loan funds, which I think is the thing I think is just spectacular for small communities who are looking at creating capital for their communities. And I am super excited to go to the session on revolving loan funds because, much like you, I am also a giant nerd. And I get really excited about things. Other people are like, yeah, okay, you have fun. Great.
But thanks for inviting me today. I think you've now both called me a nerd and a schizophrenic. So I think our day here is done.
Perfect.
Great. It was a
I
nice conversation. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. Next week we are talking to Shireen from Smeeney Made Wild. She is a fiber artist who does a lot of work in balancing adventure and fiber arts and running an entrepreneurship. And Dawn, you had mentioned Startup Colorado earlier on this call, which is a great resource for rural entrepreneurs in Colorado, and that is originally how Shireen and I got connected. So I'm pretty jazzed about that. So tune in next week if you are curious about fiber art and adventure and creative entrepreneurship communities. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.